All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Pappas. I'm the Director of Transportation Resilience and Sustainability for the Department of Transportation. And on behalf of our team, want to thank everybody for your time this afternoon for us to have our second planning conversation about the SR1 Coastal Resiliency Study. Go ahead, Joe, you can push forward. So for tonight's session, you'll be hearing from several of our team members. Again, my name is Jim Pappas. I'm the director at DelDOT. With me tonight is Stephanie Johnson, who is our assistant director at the Division of Resilience and Sustainability. And DelDOT has engaged with two very strong partners in this project. We have from AECOM, we have Joe Hofste on the line. We have Kira Murphy and Marge Quinn. And then Remline is our public outreach consultant. And we have Danielle Lloyd on the call as well. So this is the DelDOT team that will be going over the presentation and going forward. If you joined us at our last call, it's the same team, and we're committed to this project and working together in the future. So I want to thank them for their time and their effort to get us to this point, and DelDOT's really excited to continue the partnership moving forward. So the agenda for today's discussion is kind of the expectations for this workshop and the study that we've done, review the purpose and need, go through the study area, talk about some modeling that has been performed to kind of inform us in some of the decision-making going forward, talk about some actual flood mitigation and protection, kind of give you some visuals of what it may look like. We'll talk about the evaluation criteria. We're going to talk about the path forward, after today's discussion, what is DelDOT going to be doing, and also how you as the community can stay involved as well, because we really looking forward to community input as we continue with this project. And then at the end, we're going to have some question and answer, or time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, we'll be happy to answer those questions this evening. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Marge to give us some of the workshop expectations.
Thanks, Jim. Well, this is our second workshop, public workshop. This is a follow-up to the workshop that we held back in September 20th, 2022. Why are we here tonight? Well, we'd like to provide you with an update on the study, continue the public engagement process, and present findings from our coastal analysis. To keep in mind tonight, we do want to hear from you, so how to provide comments or ask questions. Well, tonight you can use the meeting's Q&A function that typically is down at the bottom of your screen anytime during the presentation and during the question and answer period. You can use the Q&A to offer up comments or to ask a question. At any time, you can fill out a comment form on the project's website. And I offer here the website for the Coastal Corridor Resiliency Study. And anytime you can also send an email to dotpublic@delaware.gov. And back to you, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Marge. And again, for our community members, again, this is a project that we want your input as we go forward with this project. As we said in the first session, and we'll talk about again tonight, we understand the critical nature of the SR1 corridor in the coastal community. So this is a really big project for DelDOT and for the state of Delaware. So community and public engagement is really important to us. So we want to stay involved and keep your engagement as we go. So the slide that you have here kind of shows the timeline of what we're going to be doing. So we're kind of, here at the public workshop number 2 in mid-2023. And we want to be very clear that this is still just a planning study. So, we're not going to go to construction tomorrow or next week or anything like that. We're still in the planning phase. Again, through tonight's session, you'll hear all the modeling and the conversations and the work that's been done to this point. But there's still many steps that we need to go through. So you'll see there on this slide to the right-hand side at the end of 24, towards the end of 2024, we will submit additional grant applications for future project work. So, and again, we mentioned this in the previous meeting we had. We're using FEMA grants for this work. So we're able to use some of their funding for this work, the planning study. we will do the same thing, go after FEMA grants for the design work, and then ultimately go to FEMA grants for construction as well. So that's kind of procedurally how DelDOT will administer this work. Again, working with AECOM and Remline, the team that you have here tonight is going to be the team that we're going to be working with throughout, so that there's continuity and consistency as we go through. So again, we'll be talking about some of the findings tonight. There will be a technical report that will be available in the future. Again, we'll upload that on the website that Marge mentioned. And that website will kind of be the clearinghouse for information. So again, any questions that you have after tonight's session here, that will be a point for you to reference. And my contact information is on there. So, at any time, feel free to reach out to me, and happy to answer any questions that anybody may have. So that kind of gives you, where we've been, where we are today, and kind of where we're going to be going to in the future. Go ahead, Joe. So again, kind of to recap the purpose and need of this project. So, why are we here tonight? Why is DelDOT? Why have we brought on the AECOM and Remline team? Again, we're looking at the resiliency of this corridor because of its critical nature and critical importance for the state of Delaware. So what we've had to do is kind of establish the existing and the future conditions. What is the road like today? How does it withstand the environmental changes that we're seeing? And more importantly, and Joe will go over this in the presentation, is looking at some of the future modeling of what is the coast and what's Route 1 going to look like in the future. Because again, we're not designing and building for today, we're designing for the future. We're going to identify the range of potential mitigation alternatives. So Kira will be going over some options and even have some pictures of some options of what we can potentially look into in the future for the mitigation side of things. We're going to talk at the end about establishing criteria to evaluate the potential alternatives. Again, looking at the options that we have, hearing from you as the public of what options you may or may not like, and kind of, judging each of those different possible alternatives that we have. We're going to talk about evaluating these mitigation alternatives. And again, we can't stress this enough, is, working with the public and the stakeholders in the area to determine what's considered the preferred alternative. What is going to meet the infrastructure needs for the department and for the state. And also we understand, the uniqueness of the coastal community, and ensuring that the aesthetics meet the engineering as we go forward. And so, again, the need of the study, again, anybody who's familiar with Delaware understands the critical nature of this as a connection point between, Dewey all the way down to Ocean City. If for whatever reason Route 1 does get closed, it's an 18-mile detour that could be up to an hour of time. And from an emergency response standpoint, that's not something that we're comfortable with. So thusly why we've initiated this study. And again, eventually we'll go to design and construction. We supports the all hazard mitigation. So again, working with DEMA, the Delaware Emergency Management Agency within Delaware, we have identified coastal threats that we have in Delaware. So we think this project is going to mitigate those concerns moving forward by building a resilient infrastructure. And again, the last two bullets there, again, we understand the importance. Some of us are Delaware natives, lived in Delaware our whole lives, spend time at the beach, love the area, love the community. And we want to ensure that it's there, not only today, tomorrow, and for future generations. So, we understand the importance of this project. And again, not just DelDOT, but the state of Delaware understands the importance of this corridor, thusly why we're doing this work. So next slide. I'm going to turn this over to Joe Hosty, the project manager from AECOM. And again, AECOM is a partner with DelDOT on this project, and we're really excited and very thankful for the work that they've done to this point. So Joe, turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Jim. So what I want to get into now is go through the study area. So as Jim mentioned, the study area is 16 miles of State Route 1. So this is the primary portion of Route 1 that's exposed to challenges from coastal flooding and bay flooding. So we're looking at 16 miles of State Route 1. The northern limits is the Dewey Beach from New Orleans Street, and that's going to go to the southern limits all the way down to the Maryland line. Going to briefly touch on the 6 different segments that we have that make up our study area. In the previous workshop, we went a little more in depth on the different segments, but The segments are broken down basically based on the different components in the area. If there's residentials on one side, if it's directly up against the bay, is it up against the ocean, what type of natural environments around it. So we broke it up in 6 segments to look at, which Kira will go into the different mitigation measures for those 6 segments. So segment 1 is our Dewey beach area, which is from King Charles Avenue to Bayberry Lane. And then segment 2 is going to be from Bayberry Lane down to Dune Road. Our segment 3 area is that northern Bethany area, which is from Dune Road to 5th Street. And then segment 4 is Bethany Beach, which is 5th Street to Logan Street. And then segment 5 is our area between Dewey and Fenwick Island, which that's Logan Street to Lewis Street. And then segment 6 is our Fenwick Island area, which is from Lewis Street down to the Delaware state border. So those are the primary 6 segments that we're looking at. As projects come out of it, future studies, the segment areas can be broken down further. But for this study, those are how we're grouping the different mitigation measures that Kira will be discussing shortly. As Jim mentioned, we performed a coastal model of the SR1, this segment area. So I'm going to keep this high level information on the coastal model, but some of the big takeaways that I want everyone to get out of. We did analysis for Bayside and Oceanside. So we looked at those as separate storm events because the flooding comes from both the Oceanside and as well the Bayside. So we looked at those separate. And as Kira goes through, we looked at the mitigation alternatives for those also separately. For this, we analyzed 4 different storm events. The short-term risk groups, which Kira will go through, are the current conditions for a 10-year storm event and then a 100-year storm event. And then the long-term risk groups is for future condition of 2075 for a 10-year storm event. What we add on to that is anticipated sea level rise of 2 feet and 2.36 feet. That's based off of studies that Delaware's done, and that's the moderate additional sea level rise for the 2075 year. So for that long term, we're looking at the 10-year and then the 100-year storm event. One of the other key things we looked at was a sediment transport model, which I'm going to get into in greater detail in the next slide. The one thing we also want to touch on is this study we've been coordinating with other groups. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is undergoing a study at the Inland Bay. So we are working with them and we're in communication with them. They're a little bit farther out with their study, but we're definitely sharing information that we have and we'll be incorporating information they have. Also, we've been talking to the different towns as part of our public outreach. And as part of that, we are starting to engage with the towns. Also, some of the towns are doing studies. So we're making sure that we incorporate study information that the towns are doing into our report, and then also sharing information that we have back to the towns. So the sediment transport model, why this is important is this study, we looked at the movement of actually the sand in the ocean and how that gets moved around. But the more important thing that's going to probably matter more for the public is we looked at the dune erosion. The dune is a great way to protect the SR1 area, the residents, and both the highway. So what we wanted to make sure was that we understood the effects of the different storms for the different, the effects on the dunes from the different storm events. So going from left to right, I have the current 10-year storm event on the left-hand side. The red area is where we're seeing major erosion to those dunes in the 10-year storm event. So in the 10-year storm event, some of the major areas that we're seeing that is north of the Indian River Inlet Bridge, and we're also seeing it south of there and in the Bethany, North Bethany area and the South Bethany area. And then that segment just north of Fenwick Island. As you can see, with the current 10-year, most of the dunes are able to withstand that, that storm event with a couple of breakthroughs in certain areas that people have probably seen those dunes fell and those areas have seen flooding. The current 100-year storm event that we're looking at for a current 100 years. So that's without the sea level rise. You're looking at near the, in your river inlet barrage, some additional dune failures in those areas. And then also the Bethany Beach area, you're looking at a more consistent failure across all those dunes in the Bethany Beach area. Once you put on sea level rise, the future 10-year becomes very close to the current 100-year storm event. So those two really now start acting the same. So with some sea level rise, we're looking at the effects of a 10-year storm event will be what the effects of a current 100-year storm event is on those dunes. So that's important when we start looking at our different mitigation measures, looking at long-term solutions. And then we're looking at the future 100-year on the far right. As you can see at that point with the sea level rise, we're looking at failures of those dunes up in the Dewey area. South of Dewey, we're pretty good, but anywhere from south of Dewey all the way to Fenwick Island, we're starting to see failures of those dunes pretty consistently throughout those areas. One of the big things that we asked the public for in our previous workshop for comments was evaluation criteria of how to start ranking these different mitigation measures. So we received some really good feedback on that. And we got some pretty consistent rankings of those different evaluation criteria that people wanted DelDOT to look at and evaluate those mitigation measures. So in order, this isn't the order that we kind of received from the public of the rankings from the public of how they perceived evaluation criteria was the most important. The top being the most important, going down to the least. So the most important one that the public said was level of flood protection, making sure the water elevations, the countermeasures protect those water elevations. The next one was environmental effects, benefits and impacts to the natural environment, and then physical constraints. That's the different physical constraints, barriers, roadways in the area, different right-of-way needs and physical constraints of properties in the area. Fourth was the construction cost, and then fifth was the benefit cost ratio. So the cost of the project to the benefit we get out of it. And then six was the community effects. And then seven was aesthetics and visual effects. So how the actual mitigations would appear to the public. And then finally was the operations and maintenance cost. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kira to go through the different flood mitigation measures.
Great, thanks, Joe. So in our last meeting, we went into detail on the different types of flood mitigation measures we were considering. And so before I dive into the analysis portion of the work, I wanted to go through a quick refresh of the different measures. So the measures are divided into primary and secondary flood protection. They may be used in conjunction with each other to create a comprehensive flood protection system. So starting on the top left, we have a flood wall, which is an exposed vertical barrier built to retain water. Then to the right, we have a buried flood wall or a structural dune, which is a buried flood wall covered with soil or sand to form a berm or a dune. Next, we have short-term deployables. There are two types of short-term deployables. The first is stored at an off-site location and then brought to site, and the second is stored on-site. So examples of the off-site type are water-filled bladder barriers, and examples of an on-site are sandbags. On the second level, we have permanent deployables, which are incorporated into the site and designed to maintain access during typical conditions. And then they rise up or slide into place during flood conditions. Some examples of these are flip-up gates, swing gates, or sliding gates. And lastly, we have raising roadways or rerouting roadways. This is great for roadways that are prone to flooding in order to preserve evacuation routes. And a raised roadway can be protected from erosion by using some of the secondary measures that are on the next slide. So some example of secondary flood mitigation measures are living shorelines, which are a bioengineered natural solution to assist in shoreline stabilization. And we also have revetments on the right, which are sloping structures formed by layers of stone that are built along shorelines of coastal areas, often to prevent erosion. So once we establish the different design segments along SR1 that Joe went through earlier in the presentation, as well as the different possible types of flood protection that I just went through, we began to assess which mitigation measures would be structurally feasible for each segment, both on the Bayside and on the ocean side of SR1. So now I'm going to walk through the analysis of each segment, both on the Bayside and the ocean side, in a little more detail. So each of the following slides will have a graph on it, as you can see in the upper right, that shows the grade as well as the design flood elevation. So the existing grade of the area is shown in gray. And then the short-term and long-term design storm flood elevations are shown in the light and dark blue. The difference between the grade and the design flood elevation is what we refer to as the height of intervention, and that's basically just how tall the mitigation measure would be. There will be a range for each segment of how tall it would need to be, but I'm just going to give you some maximums for each segment. So segment 1 extends from the northern end of the alignment through the town of Dewey Beach. This area has tons of both residential and commercial properties on both sides of the road. It's got many side streets and is overall a very dense urbanized area. So looking at the Bayside, one mitigation option is to raise and regrade the road itself. And since this is an urbanized area, we'd only want to go raise it up to maybe 1.5 feet. So this may be possible for only part of this segment. Option 2, which is also shown in the blue alignment on the left, is an exposed or buried flood wall with deployables. Because this area is so dense, we want to look at an exposed flood wall, and we would need a lot of deployables to make sure there'd still be access to the different side streets, as well as residential and commercial buildings. The third option would be to reroute the road in this area, which is shown by the orange alignment, mitigation alignment 3. We would reroute the road outside of the town, and this is a very drastic option, but it would provide an alternative evacuation route that would not impose as much construction directly in the town of Dewey. And the exact starting point of this option would require further study and analysis. Talking about the HOIs, the maximums for this segment, for the short-term design storms, we're looking anywhere up to 1.7 feet, and for the long term, anywhere up to 5.9 feet. Next slide. So on the ocean side of segment 1, our first potential option, like the Bayside, is to raise and regrade. That may only be possible for part of this segment. Add an exposed flood wall with deployables, same as the Bayside. And then the third option, shown in the alignment green, is to add a structural dune out ocean board of the road. This option may be possible for both the short-term and long-term DFE ranges, and it would not impose as much construction directly in the town. For the dune, the HOI range for the short-term storms would be up to 10.5 feet, and for the long-term range, 13 feet. These numbers are much higher since we are closer to the ocean. Moving on to segment 2, which includes the area of SR1 between the town of Dewey Beach and 3R's Fishing Beach. SR1 is mostly not urbanized in this segment, and the bayside terrain consists mostly of vegetated marshland. So our first option here would be to raise and regrade In this area, since it isn't urbanized, we can raise and regrade the road up to 3 feet. But still, because of the different HOIs, we may only be able to do this for part of this segment. The second option is an exposed or buried flood wall with deployables. In this segment, we'd need significantly less deployables than segment 1 because there are less side streets and less residential and commercial properties here. And the third option, shown in orange, as a continuation of segment 1, would be to continue rerouting the road. And we only have this as part of segment 2, since, as you can see on the Bayside, there are a lot of wetlands on the southern side of segment 2 that would be difficult from a construction and environmental standpoint to reroute a road into. And the HOI range for the Bayside here for the short-term storms ranges up to about 4.7 feet, and for the long term up to 8.1. For the ocean side of segment 2, our first option to raise and regrade like the Bayside. And the second option, like the Bayside, is to add an exposed or buried flood wall with deployables. The third option would be a structural dune on the ocean side of the road. The HOI range for the dune for short term would be up to 16.5 feet, and for the long term, set up to 17 feet. Segment 3 includes the area of SR1 between 3 R's Fishing Beach and the town of Bethany. And on the Bayside of this segment, the terrain consists mostly of vegetated marshland. So here we have 2 options for flood mitigation measures on the Bayside of the road. The first one, to raise and regrade potentially portions of the road, and the second, exposed or buried flood wall with deployables. In this segment and in segments moving forward, we do not have the reroute the road scenario as we run into land as well as additional wetlands. We don't have the space that we did for segments 1 and 2 to have rerouting the road as an option. The HOI range here would be up to 4.7 feet for short term and up to 8.1 for long term. On the ocean side of the road, our 3 potential mitigation measures include raising and regrading the road, adding exposed or buried flood wall with deployables, or again, the structural dune along the beach. And for the dune here, for the short term and long term range, we'd be looking at up to about 10 feet. Segment 4 includes the area of SR1 that runs through the town of Bethany. And this segment, like segment 1, is very dense and has lots of residential and commercial properties. On the Bayside, we look to potentially raise and regrade portions of this segment or add exposed wall with deployables. The HOI range here would be up to 4.7 feet for short term and 8.1 for long term. And then along the ocean side of the segment, the potential mitigation measures include raising and regrading for portions of the segment, adding an exposed or buried flood wall with deployables, or a structural dune outbound on the beach. And the HOI for the dune here would be short term up to 12.5 and for long term up to 12.8 feet. Segment 5 of SR1 includes the area that runs between the town of Bethany and the town of Fenwick-Isle. The Bayside of SR1 here consists mainly of vegetated marshland. Some potential flood mitigation measures here would be to raise and regrade portions of this segment, as well as add an exposed or buried flood wall with deployables. The HOI range here is a bit lower, up to 4.1 feet for short term and up to 7.5 for long term. And for the Oceanside here, again, we have alignment 1 and 2 shown in blue, which are raising and regrading the road. For 2, adding exposed or buried flood walls with deployables. And then our third option, a structural dune on the beach. The HOI range for the dune in this segment ranges up to 15 feet for the short-term storms and up to 17 for the long-term. And the final segment, segment 6, includes the southern end of the alignment and the town of Fenwick-Segment. This segment is fronted by both residential and commercial developments on both sides of the road, and like the other towns, is intersected by many side streets. On the Bayside, some potential flood mitigation measures include raising and regrading for portions of the segment, or adding an exposed flood wall with deployables. The HOI range here is up to 4.1 feet for the short term and up to 7.5 for the long term. And for the ocean side of this segment, the potential flood mitigation measures are an exposed or buried flood wall with deployables shown in blue, or outboard a structural dune shown in the alignment in green. And the HOI range for the dune goes anywhere up to 11.3 feet for the short-term range and 12.3 for the long-term. Taking a step back and looking at an overview of all the data that I just presented for the Bayside summary, we have each structural segment and then the different mitigation options that I just discussed. So we have a buried or exposed flood wall with deployables, raising the road, and rerouting and raising the road. So the buried or exposed flood wall with deployables is structurally possible for all of the segments for the short-term and the long-term risk group. Raising the road is possible for portions of every segment in the short-term risk and its risk group, and is possible for portions of segments 1 through 4 in the long-term risk group. And rerouting and raising the road may be possible for the segment 1 in the short-term risk group and part of segment 2 in the short-term risk group. Looking at the same overview and breakdown for the ocean side, we have that the buried or exposed flood wall and deployables is maybe a structural possibility for all segments for both risk groups. Raising the road or portions of each segment may be possible for the short-term risk group segments 1 through 5, the long-term 1 and 2. And then we have the structural dune, which may be possible for all of the segments for both of the risk groups. Now I'm going to pass it on to Jim.
Great. Thank you so much, Kara. So we understand that we just threw a lot of information at everybody. So again, why we wanted to go through this was kind of walk you through this. And we were going to mention this. So tonight's session is going to be being recorded. So we will be uploading that to our website as well. So, you know, if there's part of it you missed or you want to go back, you know, you have that opportunity. And the website also has our contact information. So again, you can reach out to us. So to kind of, you know, end this part of it. So what are our next steps? Again, finalize the report and the findings. So again, that's something that we are working with the team right now. And basically what that report is the detailed information of kind of everything that we've summarized tonight. So it's, you know, if you're interested in it and you want to get into a lot more detail, like the modeling, for example, that Joe went over, again, we took it at a kind of very high level, but if it's something that's of great interest to you, we will have all of the details there that you can kind of go through it, you know, step by step. We also intend to meet with each of the beach communities. We had the opportunity to do that already in advance of this meeting, but we really enjoyed having a much smaller one-on-one conversation with each of the communities. So we will be reaching out to them as well this summer to meet down with them kind of on a one-on-one. And this third bullet there is, this is how you as a community can help us. Based on what we've gone over tonight and what we went over back in September, which are the segments that you feel are the most critical that the team needs to focus on first? And which mitigation alternatives that Kira went over are the ones that you feel are the best mitigation strategies that the department and the state can use? So, again, that's the input from you as the public of the ones that will be using this infrastructure is kind of what's best for you. And then again, I mentioned on that slide when we kind of had the timeline, we will be pursuing further grant applications to advance this study. Again, all this is in our terms is this was a planning study, very high level. Once we get input from the public and kind of decide on the alternatives that we want to look at, we will then engage in the actual design. So that's, the actual calculations. And again, kind of the things that Kira went over. She went over like ranges of heights and things like that. The design step is when we would actually finalize that type of information so that we can ultimately get to construction plans so that we can ultimately build these mitigation measures for the SR1 corridor. So that's kind of how we go from the planning level, very high level discussion that we're having now, to the engineering design, and then ultimately to the construction process. So that's the steps that we as a team will be taking going forward. And the next slide, please, Joe. So I'm going to turn this slide over to Marge so she can let you know how you can stay involved.
Thanks, Jim. So we've got two primary methods by which we'd like to hear from you. The first is to visit the study's website, and I've pointed out here on the slide the study's website address, and also to complete a comment form. Jim just referenced that during the prior slide, and include your email address. Danielle Lloyd from Remline has just provided a link to the comment form in the chat, so you can actually go online now and offer up your comments. And then the next slide, I think we're going to be starting our question and answer session at this point in time. Danielle is going to be moderating this for us, and I'm reading the questions that have come in, and the team will be responding to those with answers.
All right, good evening. Okay, we've had several questions come in. The first question is, are you coordinating with the Army Corps and DENREC regarding inland bay flooding mitigation? If not, is there a plan for coordination?
Yeah, so that does, thanks for that question. So when we started this study a couple of years ago, actually, and we, again, had that first public meeting in September. So since September, a lot of things has happened. And one of the things was we were informed that the Army Corps of Engineers was going to be doing an inland bay study in Sussex County. And DENREC brought this to our attention. And so we have actually kind of become part of that team that is looking into that. And so the Corps of Engineers was advised what work we were doing. And actually we have weekly calls about that project. And we actually told them about tonight's meeting, and some of the members of the Corps may actually be on this. But yes, we are aware of that study. And in partnership with DENREC, the Army Corps of Engineers, we are coordinating work. We've actually provided some data already on some of the frequently flooded roadways around the inland bays, not just SR1. Again, those that are familiar with the Oak Orchard area and those areas around there. DelDOT has already prioritized or in the process of prioritizing those flooded roadways. So great question. And yes, we are sharing information and going to be coordinating efforts going forward.
Great. Question 2. Does this study still include the consideration of safety along the corridor, such as traffic calming options?
Yeah, so the focus of this project, again, by the title, is coastal resiliency. So we're looking, and through the presentation of what Joe and Kira went over, we're mostly focusing on ensuring the resiliency of the corridor. Safety and capacity are not part of this actual study. But the person who has that question, if you could reach out to me, and somebody can drop my email in the chat is perfectly fine. Reach out to me and I can get you in contact with our safety section within DelDOT that would be able to answer any questions that you may have. So again, we're focusing kind of on the resiliency side, but capacity and safety obviously are concerned for the department. It's just not something this is specifically taken care of, but I want to get you in contact with the appropriate people that could answer that question.
All right, this question is about adjacent towns, and the concern that keeping SR1 safe is maybe negligible if residents in those towns may be unable to get to SR1 if they need to evacuate or if it is flooded.
Yeah, so again, we've had conversations with the 4 coastal communities, and kind of factoring into not only this corridor work, but the resiliency across the entire state that that DelDOT, a couple years ago created this division to look at resiliency across the state. We're looking at the evacuation routes across the state and how can we potentially raise them or ensure that they're going to be, accessible in, evacuation events if needed. So not necessarily part of this corridor, but the work that Stephanie and I and AECOM are actually working in partnership on other projects across the state, not just here in Sussex County, but across the state, to ensure that if evacuations are needed, that the state and DelDOT are using the funding that we have available to ensure, safe access in that situation. So not directly associated with SR1, but we are kind of the parent projects, if you will, that would be tied into Route 1 are being reviewed as well.
All right, this next question has a few parts. When you talk about raising Route 1, approximately how many feet would the highway be raised? What would be the approximate timetable for the start and completion of that type of project? And would all of the costs be supported by federal and state dollars?
Okay, so I'll actually take that in reverse order. So as far as the funding, so I personally am a big fan of using as much federal money as is possible, so that saves our state funds. So we would, and there are many grant opportunities that are available out there. Again, I mentioned the planning study that we're talking about tonight. This was through a FEMA grant. So we envision working with DEMA, the Delaware Emergency Management, and also the federal partners moving forward. So we would look to use as much federal funding as we possibly could. And, with funding these type projects, there's sometimes there's a state match, and that might be like 10% or 20%, and the rest would be from the federal. So we want to use as much federal money as possible to limit the amount of state funds. And then the question as far as how much would we be raising it and the time frame, those are kind of to be determined. And again, like Kira mentioned, the ranges of heights that may be needed. The next step of the actual engineering study was when we would be able to establish, exacts. So instead of saying like we might raise it 1 to 3 feet, through the engineering calculations and the modeling, we'd be able to say we need to raise it, 2.5 feet or 2.0 feet or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of the next step of would be needed. And then the timing of all this, again, would be associated with getting the funding for the design, figuring out construction costs, and then kind of working backwards. But realistically, we are a couple years away from, actually going out and doing anything major. And I mentioned this in our meeting back in September. Our maintenance division in Sussex County does a really good job of kind of being able to keep Route 1 open during most storm events. What we're looking at here with this study is, again, longer term, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years out, where we know the intensity of these storms are going to continue to increase. And so that's why we're looking more on the long term. So short term, we think we're good. We can, pretty much keep Route 1. We're looking at, again, 5, 10 years, 20 years out.
Okay. What happens to the properties which are on the water side of the deployables?
Good question. That, again, depending on the engineering need of those deployables, if it's a situation where, and again, hypothetically, if through our design process and engineering process, there may be purchases of land that may be needed, there may be just temporary easements that may be needed. So if anybody on the call here is concerned about that right now, I'd say let's not worry about that just yet. as we go through this process, if in fact that is an alternative that is chosen by the community, and from an engineering need or engineering process, it's found that that's an appropriate mitigation option, there would be one-on-one conversations with property owners, just like we do with any other project, to determine whether it's a full take that would be needed, or is it just kind of a temporary easement that may be needed. So to the person that, it's a great question, I would say is it's not known right now, but as we again continue to refine and develop this project, we'd be in contact with the affected property owners.
In the Bethany Beach segment, what will be the impact upon Bayside residential areas of the various mitigation strategies for SR1?
Again, so for right now, we can't really answer that. Again, Kira did a good job of kind of high level what some of the options may be. Again, it's going to kind of depend on hearing from the public. What are the options that you most like, and what meet the engineering needs? And again, from there, we will further refine this, whether it's deployables, raising the road, some type of structured dune, or maybe a combination of all of those things. So again, great questions. And so you're kind of the questions that Danielle is reading is you're getting to where we want to go. So I apologize, we can't answer it right now, but those are kind of the questions that we want to be able to answer as we go through this process.
A lot of money is already spent replenishing sand on the beaches. Would the flood mitigation measures either increase the need for that, lessen it, or have no impact?
So, Joe mentioned the modeling that has taken place, and the modeling that AECOM did for us. We involved DENREC because the beach replenishment has nothing to do with DelDOT. So that's more of a DENREC Corps of Engineer work. So when Joe was going over that coastal modeling, that's not DelDOT's expertise. So we reached out to DENREC, who has a gentleman that's his expertise. So we brought him into the conversation. He reviewed the modeling that AECOM did. We had discussions with him and with the DENREC and AECOM team that did that modeling to kind of make sure everybody was on the same page and everybody was agreeable to the work that's been done. So we also, when we met with each of the beach communities, we asked that question of, where are you in some beach replenishment work? And so that is factored into the modeling, again, that Joe showed. By the time we're doing the engineering design, again, because that's going to be in future years, we would probably maybe have to look at some of that modeling again, because if some of these locations have had replenishment done, then we'd have to, again, include that in the modeling. So I guess the answer to that is it's going to kind of depend on where we are on the design phase with that replenishment process that we know takes place along the shore. Again, working with DENREC and the Corps and having them in the conversation, they can keep us updated on kind of where they are and what those future projects are, so that we can take that into consideration when we're designing our work.
Okay. The next couple of questions are again more kind of coordination questions, but has there been any attempt to work with the municipalities to discuss an approach that will protect the roadway and the properties in towns that may be on the water side of the highway?
Yes, the short answer is yes. And again, when we met, that's why we wanted to sit down with each of the communities individually, because each one of the communities has, individual challenges. And again, as Joe mentioned, this is a 16-mile corridor. And, there's a lot of different terrain and between the commercial residential properties. And so it was great when we were able to sit down with the communities, or the communities on a one-on-one, and they were actually able to inform us in some of the work that they were doing that we might not have necessarily known about in looking at resiliency in their individual communities. So that's why we want to continue that engagement with them as we've presented tonight what we're doing, and hearing what the individual communities are doing and how we can work together moving forward. Communication is super important. We appreciated being able to sit down with those communities, and we look forward to, as we continue to develop this work, further conversations.
Okay. In the same vein, you indicated you are meeting with the towns. Will there also be meetings seeking input from those of us in the study area who are not residents of the towns, as in shoreline stakeholders on the Bayside and Oceanside?
So we wanted to meet with each of those communities so that we could, maybe encompass folks, as many folks as possible. But if there are folks that are kind of, in between, so to speak, or not necessarily associated with one of those beach communities, again, feel free to reach out to me directly, and we're happy to have a conversation if, again, you're not tied in with one of those communities. Again, like Marge mentioned on her slides, is the reason we're doing this is to hear from the community. So we absolutely want to get input from the communities or individual property owners that are kind of along this corridor that may be kind of in between some of those communities or not necessarily within the incorporated boundaries.
Okay. The next question, and follow up to the deployables. Are the properties to the water side of the deployables left to be underwater?
That's again the engineering part of that we will be looking at, and everything that we're doing, again, kind of looking at this statewide. When the question, one of the questions earlier was about raising the road. And so we can't look at that blindly, just say, well, we raise the road, so that saves our road. We understand that when we do that, we're potentially damming water up somewhere else. So again, that's the modeling that AECOM does, is said, it's everything's got a reaction to doing something. So if we raise the road, where's that water going to end up going? So again, that's the further engineering and further refinement that would have to happen. I can say that when we've looked at other roads across the state, not Route 1, but other projects where we looked at potentially raising the road, there might be cases where we have to put like some drainage culverts or drainage pipes in there to kind of allow the water to flow out so that we're not actually damming it, because to the residents' question is it could dam up somewhere else. And again, that is not our intent in any way, shape, or form. So again, that's kind of where the modeling and looking at the project in totality, not just an individual location, looking at it overall of what may happen with the engineering work that we do to make sure that there's no damage downstream or upstream.
Okay, and that's all of the questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Danielle, for that, and want to thank everybody for their questions. So we are going to have another presentation at 6 o'clock. And for those that may be asking, it's the exact same content, so there's nothing different. You're certainly more than welcome to stick around for the 6 o'clock session, but we're basically going to be going through the exact same thing. So if you sat through the 5 o'clock and you feel good, then you're free. Again, the website that we have there is going to have all this information. The recording of tonight's session will ultimately be uploaded to that as well. And also, again, that website has our contact information for, if you have some questions after this, or you want to have kind of a deeper conversation about any of this, again, feel free to reach out to myself or, our team, and we'd be happy to have, deeper conversations about this project. Because again, we very much want input from the public on this. And so we look forward to working with all of you in the future to make this a resilient corridor for the state and for you as, residents in that area. So with that, again, we thank you for your time and consideration tonight. Thank you so much for the questions that were posed. And again, we will be back at 6 o'clock with the next session. And again, if you're good, then have a great rest of your evening. And again, thank you so much for your time.